welcome to this conversation. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Galvin Ngo. I am currently the director of the Ateneo Institute, or the Ateneo Institute for the Science and Art of Learning and Teaching. Today, we're going to talk about something quite interesting, at least for us, for a lot of us here in this conversation, the future of education. In the past 2 years, education has been one of the industries, one of the things that have been really disrupted by the pandemic, by the shift to online learning, among other things. And as we rebuild education moving forward, we'd like to find out what's in it for us. We'd like to find out how we might want education to be like. So joining me today in this conversation are two people who I've met in two different parts of my life. First, I'd like to introduce Thess. Say hi, Thess.
Hello.
This is Thess Nebres-Ladrido. She's the high school principal in Xavier School, San Juan. Thess was my former boss when I used to work there as a computer education teacher. And also with me today is another boss, now one of my bosses in the Gokongwei Brothers School of Education and Learning Design in Ateneo De Manila University, Dr. Isabel Martin. Hi, Isabel.
Hi, Galvin. Hi, Thess.
Dr. Martin is currently our chair for the Department of Educational Leadership and Management. So, thanks for joining me today. I know that you're all busy. You're both busy with so many things that you're doing. And I wanted us to come together today to talk about what you think education might be like. No? So I thought of a warm-up question for us, something easy. How has it been for you as an educator over the past 2 years? Yeah. Tess, would you like to begin?
Okay, do we have 3 hours to answer that, or the entire day? Because I think that's a very... Yeah, I might have a catharsis just answering that question. Maybe just to share that it's really been quite a crazy school year, past 2 school years. It's been quite exciting as well because, as you know, when I started to become principal, it was during the start of the pandemic. So I really didn't expect that the situation would be like this, and it was really kind of crazy, but at the same time, really exciting to be starting many new things.
So that's from Tess and in a basic ed setting. No? How about for you, Isabel? How has it been for you over the past 2 years?
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Tess said. No, the word is crazy. It was really a crazy 2 years. In the past, when I am asked that question, I would say, busy as usual. But now when I am asked that question, that's what I would say. It was a crazy 2 years, but also that I think it was 2 years that made me learn so many new things I've never imagined I would learn. So I was thinking maybe that the pandemic taught me a lot of good things too that we can use for education moving forward.
Thanks, Isabel. If I may also share, yes, it's also been pretty much like a roller coaster ride for me as a teacher myself. There were so many changes, and as Isabel mentioned, there are so many things that have really challenged our thinking, challenged our practice. But at the same time, as we went through this journey, there were also a lot of things that we learned, a lot of things that we can actually pick up and bring with us as we reimagine things moving forward. So I thought that we'd first talk about that. What are some of the things that you've seen happen in the past few years in education in your own space that you think we can do more of? Let's start with the good news first. What are good things that you've been able to see? What are some bright spots that you've been able to see in your own institutions, in your own experiences, that you hope we can do more moving forward? Belle, would you want to start?
Okay, go ahead. Can I begin?
Okay.
Yes. So even pre-pandemic, now we're already living in a VUCA world. I'm sure you've heard that all the time. A lot of times volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And therefore, I think really that many schools are really exerting effort to move towards that. So there are a lot of initiatives to really change or at least revise the kind of way they teach the students and what they teach as well. So for me, I'm thinking of many things in terms of methodologies and also many things in terms of content and skills that we have already changed during the past how many years. So for example, in terms of the way we teach students, we've now started to really engage in project-based learning, for instance. So more of the experiential learning kind of strategies or methods. And then, of course, course, there's also the push for STEM or STEAM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, because we're in a world where now we really need to innovate because there are so many problems that we need to solve. Those are the things that are on top of my mind as of the moment.
Okay, Thess, that was a lot, so maybe we can unpack that a little bit. Maybe we can start with that bit about VUCA. I mean, VUCA is something that we hear a lot about, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, describing the kind of world, describing the phenomenon that we're all experiencing right now. How has the VUCA-ness of the world affected your work in education at the moment?
Okay, so again, that's a very cathartic question. I really think that, you know, I've been teaching for the past, I've been in education for the past 24 years. You were still in high school then, okay, when I started teaching. And when I think about how I have evolved as an educator and how the educational landscape has changed over the years, I think that I had, as an educator, constantly do a lot of reflection and really check on if what I'm teaching now or the way we're teaching now, are they still relevant? Because everything has to be contextualized. So in other words, how has it affected us? It has really pushed many educators to really constantly, you know, rethink the way they do things, to always make sure that what they're doing, what they're teaching are relevant.
And one of the
I'm
things
not sure if I make sense.
Sorry.
I'm not sure if I'm making sense. Go ahead.
Making sense. Making sense.
No, I just wanted to ask about one of the changes that you mentioned earlier. You talked about experiences like project-based learning. Maybe that's not many people are familiar with it. Would you mind describing what that looks like? And when comparing that to how we may have experienced education in the past, in the traditional sense, how would you compare project-based learning as an approach in comparison to previous ways of doing it?
Actually, project-based learning may not necessarily be new to a lot of people. I think they've already been doing it. They're just not aware that, you know, there are features already of the PBL that they're doing. Project-based learning is really, I can't say it's an assessment because it's not. It's like a teaching methodology, framework, etc., where you really, the unit is not based on a specific skill or content, but really it's based on a problem that you have to answer. And therefore, as you grapple with the responses or the answers to that question, you also learn in the process. So what I really like about that is you're not just focusing on the project or the product, but really the process, because you learn so many dispositions that I think are very crucial for the 21st century. So you develop content, you get to know important skills, deepen your understanding of those skills and those concepts, but at the same time, develop really key dispositions that are life skills and also career skills.
So how does student experience look like in a project-based learning scenario? Like we're all quite familiar with the subjects, right? Science, math, English, and all of these other subjects that you have periods in when you in your class schedule, for example. But in project-based learning, does that change? How does that look like?
Because project-based learning can actually be a standalone unit. So, for example, an English subject can carry out a PBL just as an isolated subject, or it can have transdisciplinary connections or interdisciplinary. But PBL, because it's very authentic, by its very nature, it's already trans. Okay, it's kind of messy because you really have to make sure that you coordinate with the different departments, you find connections. Maybe just to concretize it, for example, in grade 10, we have this science, CLE, and computer interdisciplinary PBL, where the question they had to ask for one entire quarter was in science, that was the core. How do we bring in more green in Xavier School? Because we noticed that, you know, there are a lot of concrete buildings, etc., but we seem to be lacking in greenery. Okay, so the focus there was really the environment and sustainability. And therefore, when the students started to present, that question was presented to them, there were a lot of possible responses to that. In the process of responding, researching, gathering data, they also get to know key important skills about sustainability, about environment, about flora. Okay, and then they also use technology to be able to respond to their questions or answer to the questions. And then at the end of it, they present a proposal to the school. They presented a proposal to the school director, Father Ari, where they said these are the ways we can bring in more nature or green to Xavier School. And of course, an important aspect of that is also stewardship, which is very much crucial in the CLE subject as well.
Thanks, Tess. Okay, so I sort of get it now. So in project-based learning, I guess what I'm hearing from you is you're really trying to ground what you want students to learn in how they will authentically use them, not just to learn subjects in isolation, but to try to put them in situations wherein they will actually use what they're learning in the specific subjects, right?
Exactly. So it's very authentic, it's very real world, maybe compared to how we usually assess or teach students, where, sometimes it's just really purely lecture, and then at the end of the lecture, you give them a worksheet, and then afterwards, you give them an assessment, multiple choice, maybe a long test.
Thanks, Tess. So for basic ed, this is one pitch, maybe more of project-based learning. How about you, Isabel? How's it been? What are some things that you'd like to share on this topic?
Right. So on the issue of what we have been doing before the pandemic that we would like to do more of, it's really internet connectivity. I mean, even before the pandemic, we in the higher ed, in the Loyola schools, we have already been using learning management systems. But the pandemic forced us to look at educational technology in a different light. Now, it's practically the default mode. I came across facts and figures of the ITU, the International Technological Union. I think it is the United Nations agency for ICT, and they reported that in 2021, about 62% of the world's population, 4.9 billion, have already been using the internet heavily. And that's a very big jump, from 2019 figures, which are like mga 800 million. So if you think in those terms, what we're seeing is that the pandemic really forced us to work very closely or work mainly with what we find on the web, and that can be quite challenging, especially in terms of teacher education, preparing our teachers. Now with this reliance on internet connectivity, we may have to produce a different kind of teacher. The 21st century teacher will have a different skill set. First of all, in terms of having the skills to handle multiple modalities, because texts now come to our classroom as multimodal texts. I think our teachers have to have that ability to curate the text, but also to use them for teaching and learning. The second thing that we're finding out is that if you are technologically challenged, maybe teaching is not the best profession for you in the 21st century. If you are afraid of technology, you might want to consider another profession, because in the 21st century, we're really looking at reliance on internet connection. But then, of course, we know that the internet does not always bring good things to us in the classroom. So the teacher of the 21st century should also be very reflexive and critical. Should also be able to, we know this, to know the difference between what's fake and what's not. So all of these things that I think we need to amplify for our teaching.
#relevant. So
yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up, Isabel. Most especially in the past few years, as schools needed to shift to some form of online and remote learning, connectivity has played a crucial role. As you mentioned, our classrooms are now the screens and the software that we're using, and without having the capacity to actually be able to use them, then it gets in the way of our actual teaching.
Yes, that's true.
So two things. So two things that you've mentioned that you'd like to amplify, you'd like to do more in education. Thess mentioned more authentic experiences in the form of project-based learning as an example. And then Isabel talked about the new kind of teacher that we need. A teacher who does not just have the teaching skills as we know it, but maybe technology skills. They're now part of the teaching skills that are necessary. All right, let's now talk about something a little more controversial. If you were to retire something in education, what are some things that you think we need to retire? We need to think about shelving. We need to think about, let's stop doing this already. And I think we have this opportunity right now because we're now going back on campus. We're now shifting to what people are calling the new normal. And there's this opportunity to recraft what education is, right? So what do you think should we leave behind? Should we not bring back to campus, so to speak? So anyone, what do you think?
Okay, I hope I don't lose my job. Just kidding. No, but I was thinking maybe the heavy, too much reliance on textbooks. If we can, you know, let go of textbooks, because the tendency is that, of course, we need to question all the time the quality of the textbooks we use. But apart from that, the tendency is that the teachers use the textbook as their default curriculum. And therefore, there's really very little room for them to curate, to really do reflective teaching, or to ensure that it's really relevant to the context of their students, of their school, and the society. So that's one. Second, I'm not sure, but yung mga drill and kill exercises and worksheets, I'm sure they do have a place in certain subject areas and also in certain, they may be considered as a genre, but again, too much reliance on the drill and kill form of teaching students, because you assume that what they do is behavioral, when sometimes you also have to figure in that a lot of the things they need to do also has a cognitive aspect. And then third, third would be perhaps the cha-cha-cha curriculum. I think Ms. Isabel mentioned that already, or Galvin mentioned that, that, you know, we need to see that the subjects are really all interrelated and connected, and therefore we can't really segment them to be just categorize them as this is just really science or this is just really math. So, of course, amplifying it is to make sure that there are more interdisciplinary activities and learning experiences. There you go.
My turn. Okay. Nako, that's very, I have a long list of what I think should be retired. And the list actually is something that's already was my list before the pandemic came. No, I think the first there is teacher-centeredness. Whether or not we have the pandemic, we're still finding that many of the teaching, learning practices that we see today, and which is highlighted not because of moving online, is still very much teacher-centered. No, there are claims that we do student-centered teaching or learning-centered teaching, but if you look at how the practices go, they're still very teacher-directed or teacher-oriented. So this is like similar also and very much related to, I'm sure those of us listening to us today are familiar with what Freire calls the banking system of education, where literally you deposit knowledge into the students' heads, and then you withdraw during the exam. Deposit, withdraw, deposit. It's still there, regardless of the presence of educational innovation. It's still there. And one indicator of this, I think, from the point of view of educational supervision, is teacher talk. So if you see that the percentage of teacher talk is higher than students talking, I think not much learning takes place there. So that's one. The second also is, I think, and we're also finding out, over-reliance on knowledge consumption. It's like the focus is to acquire knowledge, but we know in the 21st century, acquiring knowledge is actually a lower order skill because you can Google practically anything and use your phone. The challenge is what to do with the knowledge. The challenge is not the consumption of knowledge, it's the production of knowledge. And I've encountered in one course on e-learning technologies, the use of the term prosumption, no? The learner as a producer, but also a consumer of knowledge. So that's, I think we have to retire that idea that education is about gaining knowledge, no? Because I mean, it's easy to get the knowledge. Google is the easiest to access now. Then the other thing, I also want to extend what Thess said about textbooks. No, I'm also hope that in the future we would consider not relying too much on textbooks, because textbooks tend to be fixed. They tend to standardize things, whereas there are so many learning materials available on the web now that are regularly updated, and they come in multimodal ways. So I think we have to retire this need to standardize everything, because when we do that, we actually deny the reality of diversity, no, in our schools and in the classroom. There's so much to retire, actually, but
right. And dami nating sinabi sa retire, no?
I want to add something to what Ms. Isabel said. So she was talking about the retirement. I was thinking the entire educational structure that we have, it's 120 years old. I think we really need to revisit, because many of the things, the specific structure of education, the length of the periods, the spaces in the classroom, all those things, even what Isabel mentioned about the shift of mindset, the roles of the educator, the learners, and even the product in the process. I think those have to be rethought, and then eventually the others, which are really not anymore relevant to our context, should eventually be retired.
Right. Thanks. Actually, while listening to you guys, if I may also answer the question, my answer would be to really retire this whole notion that learning is a passive process. I think, I think
agree.
A lot of us are, I mean, in terms of paradigm, I think that's one of the worst paradigms that really promotes practices that we want to really begin to retire. The assumption that when learners enter your classrooms, listen to you, they're learning. Yes, but that is an assumption. And there are ways to make that process more active, because we know for a fact that learning is an active process. We know for a fact in research, in theory, in learning sciences, that when we learn, when I'm listening to you, it's not automatic that I'm learning, right? When I'm listening to you, for example, when I'm looking at a video, when I'm reading this, I should actively engage with the material for me to actually learn. And I think that's one of the things that we realized over the pandemic and this sudden shift to online learning. A lot of educators have now began to ask questions about how the learning experience of students are like. Most especially because we're now asked to design learning experiences where we are not present, right? Like in online learning, when we design asynchronous modules, we're assuming that we're not there. And so we need to begin to second guess the experience of students as they go through the learning experience. So for me, that's really one key idea that I feel hopefully we can really retire. Let's dispel that myth that learning is a passive process. It's an active process. And let's remind ourselves of that and ask questions around what this means for us as educators, what this means for us when we design learning experiences. So in relation to that, as we design learning experiences and as we redesign education moving forward, what are some things that you think, what are some new things that you think we will need to do? So we talked about things that we need to retire. So looking at some things that we've been doing before that we can begin to shelf, or that desirably we now begin to shelf. We also talked about things that we've seen done that hopefully we can do more. But then right now, as we, libre man mangarap, diba? As you reimagine the future, what are some new things that you think will be necessary to reimagine?
I was thinking that, of course, after the pandemic, when the students start to do in person again, at least in the context of the Philippines, the world has really changed over the past 2 years. And therefore, the situation, the learning environment calls for a lot of flexibility, establishing relationships and deep engagement really with the world. And therefore, I think that it's important for us to really focus many of our efforts in education to get to know our students. So that means that we try to help them develop and identify who they really are. So a lot of socio-emotional learning really explicitly integrated in the curriculum. I don't know yet how exactly that will look like, but that one. And then, of course, some don't really want to talk about it, but I think it's integral, important, and very timely would be sex and relationship education. Okay, because we're a country that we have certain beliefs and values, but I think that has to be integrated already in the curriculum or in the learning experiences.
Isabel?
Yeah, so the what ifs. This is the what ifs part. No? Going back to earlier, I talked about the facts and figures that I recently came across in the website of ITU. That same website reported that there's really a significant digital divide in the world today. And the digital divide is really between, well, as we know, age groups, that's expected, but also urban and rural people, but also there's a digital divide between male and female. It seems that women are marginalized technologically. So what I'm saying is that really, if I had my dream, the hope is really that, at least for the Philippines, if we can have 100% internet connection available to everyone and to make it so easily accessible like drinking water. But of course, that's the job of government. So that's not, something we can do. So we have to vote wisely this coming election. But for schools, for teacher ed, what ifs can include things like, what if educational technologies are actually required? They're not supplementary or complementary, but they're actually required. All schools are smart classrooms, have smart classrooms. What if we focus more on formative assessments rather than just, looking at summative, so that, a feedback is constantly given to our students? What if we make collaboration the default strategy for working on the assessment task? Because we can collaborate easily now with the help of educational technology. What if our curriculum, what if our teaching, what if our assessments are not fixed? No, they're not really standardized. They're adaptive. They're not homogenized. They are differentiated. So because more and more we're seeing a lot of diversity in the classroom, these are questions that I'm hoping that we can also address in teacher education and even in higher education as we move forward. No? In education in the 21st century.
Right. To build on what Isabel mentioned, I guess for me, my what if would be, what if there will be more pathways to education? And I think, again, that's one of the things that I've seen in the past 2 years. Again, we all went, as we began this conversation with, crazy, thinking about what needs to be done, trying to find out how we can continue teaching despite not being in the classroom, despite not being in the physical classroom. But then I think that when we look at our experience in the past 2 years, one thing that we can create more are really opportunities for those who aren't able to access the traditional education. And it's quite interesting because let me just share a brief story. I remember one of my students in the first semester when we moved to online learning. She was an athlete, and one of the things that she told me at the end of the semester is that this was her best semester. I mean, not to put myself on the pedestal, not because of my class, but she thought that it was the best semester because it was the first time where she had enough flexibility to actually engage in her learning while still engaging in her practices, in her sport, among other things. So when I think about students like that, and when I think about things just going back to normal, so to speak, what happens to them? What happens to the opportunities that they've been able to take advantage of because of the challenges that we're facing right now? So I guess my hope is, what if we create more opportunities for them? What if we try to understand who this has worked for? Because I think that when we look at the past 2 years, we've often talked about how this has not worked. And rightly so, because it has not worked for a lot of people. Yeah. But I think we also need to recognize that it has worked for some people. And to identify who those people are and how can we continue to create opportunities for those people who this setup actually works for.
Right. Galvin, if I may just pick up from what you said, because that was the experience of your student, that's what you shared. I think we also need to be more in touch with the needs and the interests of our students. In other words, we need to listen to them more, give them more voice, give them more choice, because that's also how we will know what opportunities to give them. I just really think about our students, for example, who sometimes in the classroom, of course, when they're doing their usual lessons, they're engaged, but they're not as engaged as when you see them do committee work or clubs, where they're really empowered, they have student agency, they can create, they can innovate, they can really voice out their opinions. And I think that, we really also need to listen to the learners, not just really, literally listening to them, but being really more in touch with their feelings, and what the world means to them, how they view the world.
Right. I like what you said. Like, what if schools or school time or school schedules or classes were like clubs? What can we learn from what engages students in these clubs and bring that into what happens in teaching? And I guess to be able to really meet these what ifs, we have to begin to challenge some rules, right? What do you think are the rules that you think are necessary to challenge if we are to begin to make these things happen?
No, I have one.
Go ahead.
Well, the fact that we have a classroom with 4 walls, the physical space, that has to be rethought. I mean, like, I tell my colleagues at the Loyola schools, I'm not going back to the blackboard and the chalk anymore. No, I'm not going to see the 4-wall classroom in the same way anymore. Okay, it will not be like before, because learning can take place anywhere. Learning is ubiquitous. We don't need the 4 walls of the classroom for that. That's one. The physical space. We have to be a bit more creative about what we can do with the physical space. And maybe, as what Thess mentioned, club type. It's more on, socializing and working together on a project. But I don't think I can go back and lecture, like what we used to do in the past. That's one. Maybe another rule is the idea that the more content you put in a course, the better it is. That's not true. No, I mean, that's like content dumping. That should be. It's I can't even begin to explain why it's not gonna work. It doesn't work. That's one rule that I think should be considered. So the curriculum, the teaching practice, and the assessments, they have to be rethought. They have to be designed in a way that adjustments can be made at every point. It's not too fixed, no. You constantly make adjustments, no, even after the semester has begun. No. So the idea of everything fixed, it's change is the constant. We know that now.
If I may add to that, you mentioned the fixing and then the space, the learning spaces. This might be controversial, but maybe the grading system. I think I don't know. I'm not sure if it's doing more harm than good. I don't know. Maybe I'm talking about the more traditional system of grading and maybe the more traditional giving out of rewards, extrinsic motivation, because sometimes students really do things because they want this particular consequence, and therefore it really prevents them from taking risks. Diba? For trying and then failing, which is an important part of life, being able to cope with it. So I think we need to hopefully not think about grading, and also maybe think of, as I've said, micro-credentials. I think that's something that colleges do now. Another way of really rewarding students or giving them feedback about what they have accomplished.
Thanks. I think those are quite, it's so fun to talk about these rule-breaking things, right? Because, in reality, it's going to be challenging to break these rules. But I think that as we've been talking about today, it's quite important to have conversations about which rules are still relevant, right? Because rules were set up with a certain context, and maybe the context has changed. And so we need to ask questions around, are the rules still relevant to our context today? Which rules are still relevant? which rules are no longer relevant, which rules can be challenged, and maybe we can begin to challenge them in small ways, All right. So maybe just to wrap things up, I thought that I'd ask a similar question to how we began this conversation. So if you were to think about, let's say a lot of the things that we talked about can happen. Of course, not all of them, realistically speaking. But let's imagine that a good number of the things that we talked about, that we imagine today, might happen, let's say, in 10 years' time. So imagine that I'm going to ask you in 10 years' time how it's been as an educator. What would you hope a teacher would say? So in 10 years' time, after all of these changes, if I were to ask a teacher, so how has your experience been as a teacher? How would you hope this teacher would be able to answer? Tess?
I hope that the teacher and maybe even the administrator would say that it has been a very rewarding, life-changing experience because he or she was able to have a learner or develop a learner who has embraced diversity and authenticity, and also she was able to spark joy, curiosity among her students, such that the student feels very happy. Ultimately, I think that's what we want our students to end up, to be happy with their lives, whatever their life choices are, to be productive, and to really reach, hopefully, self-actualization there.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that question from the point of view of a TEI, a Teacher Education Institution, which is what GBSILG is. 10 years from now, I'm hoping that teachers would say that I was prepared. My education, my teacher education prepared me for this kind of challenges. The unpredictability of things, the VUCA world, the constant change in technology. I'd like that teacher to say that I was prepared to teach in this way, in this world.
For me, if I were to answer this question, I'd recall something that, so in the past few years, I've been fortunately involved in a lot of teacher training teachers all over the Philippines in higher ed and basic ed. And one of the best quotes that really fills my heart and makes me feel fulfilled as a teacher is when a teacher approaches me after a training and says, I'm excited to go back to the classroom. I'm excited to teach. And for me, I think that's one of the things that I hope teachers will end up feeling after all of these changes happen. Because I can imagine that based on our conversation today, if all of these things happen, how exciting the school experience will be, not just for students, but for teachers as well, right? That you're not just there standing in front of the room saying the same thing from one period to another. You're really there with your students, engaging with them, getting to know them, helping form them, seeing them grow. And I think that's one of the things that personally as a teacher, I'm really looking forward to going back on campus. Of course, I do look forward to being in the classroom and doing some things in the classroom with my students. But I think that if I am allowed to do some of the things that I've already been doing in a remote setting, what I imagine my classroom to be like will really be more of that, really be more of forming those relationships with students. When you think about the future, so maybe we'll do one last round. So you talked about how you imagine teachers describing their experience in the future, 10 years from now. No? So just to close our conversation, let's think about students this time. So if you were a learner who went through that awesome experience, the new educational experience that we fictionally designed today, what is a quote that you would hope for learners to be able to tell you, let's say when they graduate, 10 years from now? Anyone?
I hope that the students will say, or one of my students would say that I was really able to use my learnings, the skills I've learned, whatever it is that I learned from my teachers in real life, and I was able to help others have better lives because of the education that I had.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine. I hope that my student in the future would say something like, I may not remember everything that I learned, but I remember the skills that allows me to learn how to learn. In other words, you'd like to believe that what you're imparting in the classroom is really skills for lifelong learning, because learning really never stops even after you leave school. Learning is everywhere, anywhere. So I'd like my student to say, I learned how to learn in your class. So
I'd like to build on what Isabel mentioned. Like, if I were to answer the question, maybe what I would say is that I was able to learn how to learn, and I think I can learn more anytime, because I think that will be a very important skill that graduates will need to have in the future. Things will always change, as we've established in this conversation. Like, in this conversation, I've heard you talk about change in so many different words and so many different perspectives. And I think one of the things that we can really take away from today's conversation is that we will need to face these changes, and the changes will continue to happen. But as educators in this education space, what we need to do is to make the most out of the changes, so to speak. To try to think about what we're learning, what are some great things that are happening, can we do more of that? To think about what we need to shelf, to think about things that are not working anymore, and to finally shelf them, and to think about the possibilities that we think we need to entertain, not just for us teachers, but for our students as well. So, thank you very much for joining this conversation today, Isabel, Thess, and for those who
Thank you very
viewed
much.
this conversation. I hope that in as much as we tried to share our thoughts about the questions raised today, you will be able to raise your own questions, because we think that that's really how we can reimagine education, by starting to ask these important questions. What are things that you want to do more? What are things that we need to do less? And what are new things that we should entertain as part of our practice?